Some stories are hard to hear, and this is one of them. I have to be honest about that. This story is absolutely horrific, but it's a real story. It happened to a real black person during a time when stories like this were common. This is the kind of story some people want to forget about. They don't want to talk about the brutality and the pain that black people endured for centuries. But this story has to be told. It has to be told so that the memory of those who lived and died in injustice is not lost to injustice. They matter. And what happened to them mattered. This story is just one of thousands. Before I tell you what happened in this story, let me set the scene for you first. Because I want you to understand what I'm going to tell you was not an isolated event. I've talked before about lynchings in Mississippi and how bad they were. By 1962, at least 538 black people had been lynched in Mississippi alone. It was the highest number in the United States. Even though Georgia and Texas were close rivals, Mississippi was the worst. It was also the most embarrassing state for members of Congress who opposed passing federal anti-lynching law. Mississippi ranked first in every category. First in the most lynchings. First in the most multiple lynchings. First in lynchings per capita. First in female victims. First in victims taken from police custody. First in lynchings with no arrest or convictions of the mob. First in public support for mob justice. Until the late 19th century, hanging and firing at victims were the most common forms of lynchings in Mississippi. But as overall lynching numbers began to decline in the 20th century, the mobs grew even more gruesome and barbaric. Mississippi mobs lynched black people with blowtorches. They tortured victims with hot irons. They drowned them. They bludgeoned them. They dragged them behind cars. Whereas mutilation was once rare, it became commonplace. Between 1900 and 1940, at least 15 black people were lynched by public burning. One newspaper called these Negro barbecues. In 1904, Luther Hopper and his wife were lynched by being burned alive after he was accused of taking the life of a white planter. A crowd of 1,000 gathered to watch. Before burning them, the mob cut off their ears and severed their fingers, and they gouged out their eyes, one by one. And as bad as this sounds, in this video, I'm going to tell you about an absolutely horrific story. A story about a black teen in Mississippi. A black teen who found himself a victim of Mississippi's most gruesome form of mob violence. L.Q. Ivy was born to Jim Ivy and Allie Pegas in 1907. He was one of several children. Both Jim and Allie were the children of formerly enslaved black people. Jim was born in 1872 and Allie in 1884. The two married in 1903 and had 7 children together, 4 girls and 3 boys. The family worked hard as farmers, steadily building on what they had. And they did well for themselves. So well that Jim was able to do something that not a lot of black people were able to do. By 1920, he owned his own car. This was no insignificant feat. Being able to purchase a vehicle was a sign of upward mobility and financial stability, something practically no black family had during this time and only a small number of whites could afford. In just 3 generations, LQ's family had gone from the chains of slavery and bondage to defying expectations. Black people were supposed to stay at the bottom, but they refused. LQ's ancestors, 2 sisters named Harriet and Lottie, were enslaved in South Carolina and brought to Texas by the Pegases, the white family that owned them. They walked a perilous journey, moving from one state of bondage and brutality to another. They left slavery and entered freedom with nothing. And yet, just a few generations later, their descendants were thriving. But all of this was about to change, because, as I said before, during this time, injustice was always lurking around the corner. And it didn't matter how hard you worked or how well you were doing in life. All that mattered was race. And all that mattered was injustice. By 1925, LQ was around 17 years old. He was described as a quiet young man with a good sense of humor. Someone people enjoyed being around. He was funny, but he was also respectful. He was likable, but also kind. The type of person who was always willing to lend a helping hand to someone in need, regardless of who they were or where they came from. One day, LQ helped a white man named Jeff Prather. Jeff's car had broken down, and when LQ saw him stranded on the side of the road, he didn't hesitate to stop and help. When Jeff offered to pay him, LQ refused. That was just the kind of person he was. Kind, considerate, and selfless. And he had a girlfriend too, a young woman named Inez Williams. His parents, Jim and Allie, often said that LQ was the kind of son every parent hoped for, and they considered themselves lucky to have him. LQ wasn't just a good son. He was a brother, a friend, and a neighbor. People knew him for his kindness, his willingness to help, and his easygoing nature. He was someone worth remembering, not just for how he died, but for how he lived. I told you these details about LQ and his family because it's rare that I get to tell you about family details. It's rare that I get to tell you about the humanity of a black person who suffered at the hands of injustice and hatred. So many times, the dignity of how a person lived is forgotten, buried beneath the loss, the trauma, and the pain they suffered. The lynching often overshadows the love they had for their family and friends. The brutality they experienced is told, but not the bonds they built in their community. We know of the cruelty they endured in death, but not the compassion they showed in life. We know the lies told to justify their death, but not the legacy they left behind. We speak of the horror the mob inflicted on them, but we don't speak of their heart. And that is the byproduct of injustice and racism. The love and the life of a person are hidden behind the lynching tree of terror and shame. We've spent time learning about LQ, his life, and his family, and the love that surrounded him. But this is where the humanity ends and the brutality begins. From here, the story takes a turn into something truly horrific, something that reveals the depths of cruelty and inhumanity. What happens next is a reminder of just how deep hatred can go. September 18, 1925 was supposed to be just another day for LQ, and it was one he was excited about because he was going to make some money. LQ had been hired by a man named Lawrence Goolsby to cut timber on Goolsby's sawmill. That morning, he left his home in Lafayette County and traveled to Union County, where the sawmill was located. He was prepared for a long day of work. Now, you have to understand, cutting timber was hard work. It was a job for men, demanding both grit and strength. The fact that 17-year-old LQ was hired for this meant something. He was stepping out of boyhood and into manhood, and he was ready for this, ready to contribute, to build, to continue his family's legacy of progress. That day, LQ worked alongside 3 other young men, Cleveland Jones, Shrill Kilpatrick, and Spencer Ivy. Together, they spent the morning cutting timber under the brutal and unrelenting Mississippi sun. By lunchtime, they were exhausted and ready for a break. They made their way to a local well to get a drink of water. Little did LQ know, this would be the last moment of peace he would ever have in his short life. At the same time that LQ and the other young men were resting from their workday, something horrible was happening. Bessie Gaines, a 22-year-old white woman, reported a crime for which there was only one punishment, a crime where the mob never waited for the courts, a crime where they saw it as their duty to carry out the arrest, the trial, and the execution on their own terms. Bessie Gaines was from a prominent family in Union County. The family lived in Etta. Her father, Bob Gaines, was a prominent and well-known farmer. On Friday, September 18, 1925, the same day LQ was cutting timber for Lawrence Goolsby, Bessie claimed that she was attacked. She said that she had left her baby inside the family home and went into the field to pick peas. That's when, she said, a black man attacked her. She later told authorities that she was in such bad condition that she had to crawl back to the house. When her family found her, she was so distraught she couldn't speak clearly. A neighbor immediately drove her to Mays Hospital in New Albany and called Sheriff John W. Roberts. Sheriff John Roberts wasted no time. He gathered a posse of men and dogs to hunt down the alleged perpetrator. They took the dogs to the pea patch where Bessie said she had been attacked. The dogs sniffed the ground and then took off running. The men followed through the fields and the woods until they came upon 3 black men cutting timber: LQ, Cleveland Jones, and Shrill Kilpatrick. What happened next is unclear. We don't know what was said. We don't know what was done. What we do know is this: LQ was the one who was arrested. Why he was arrested, we don't know. Some have suggested that it may have been LQ's father's success. His father, Jim Ivy, had secured a contract to haul gravel for the new highway. In a time when white people were struggling, Jim's success was seen as an affront to white rule and may have been a cause for LQ being blamed for this crime. Fearing he would be lynched, authorities quickly moved LQ to Aberdeen to get him away from the mob. But word spread fast. Bob Gaines' daughter had been attacked, and the suspect was a black man. Shock turned to rage, and then rage turned to mob vengeance. Soon, a crowd of over 300 people gathered outside the courthouse. One newspaper reported that men abandoned their crops and their fields as soon as they heard the news. Outside the courthouse, the mob demanded that LQ be turned over to them. The mob wanted blood, and they weren't leaving until they got what they came for. As time passed, the crowd swelled, and their rage intensified. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time before they couldn't be contained, and that violence was coming. Then Mississippi U.S. Senator Hubert D. Stevens a Union County native, came out to see if he could calm the mob. To his surprise, he was able to get them to leave. But let's be clear, Stevens didn't do this because he was against lynching, and he certainly wasn't a defender of black people. At the time, the NAACP was leading the charge against lynching, pushing for the federal government to finally take action and pass a law. Over 100 anti-lynching bills were introduced in Congress between 1882 and 1952. Not a single one of them passed. Southern legislators, including men like Stevens, led the opposition. Their reason was that the federal government had no right to tell Southern states how to handle their black population, and Stevens feared that LQ's lynching would be another reason to point the finger at Mississippi for why a federal anti-lynching bill was necessary. The mob leaving was only temporary. They had no intention of letting this go. They were only going home for the evening. Soon, plans began to take shape to ensure that they would get access to LQ. A group of men from Etta obtained a writ from Judge Thomas Pegram, requiring Sheriff Roberts to bring LQ back to New Albany. They told the judge that Bessie needed to see LQ to confirm his identity, because they feared that she might not survive her injuries. But this was clearly a setup. Sheriff Roberts had no choice but to comply. But he also knew that if he brought LQ back to the New Albany courthouse, the mob would seize him. So instead, he quietly took LQ to the hospital for identification, without the mob knowing. Inside the hospital room, Bessie sat face to face with LQ. Also in the room were Sheriff Roberts, Judge Pegram, and attorney L.K. Carlton. They asked Bessie if LQ was the one who attacked her. She looked at him and hesitated. Then she said she thought he might be. But her answer was uncertain. Attorney L.K. Carlton wasn't satisfied. He pushed her further. He said, "If you testify in court, would you say LQ was the attacker?" Bessie looked at LQ again, and then she said, "I think I would." Her response left more questions than answers. Even her own father, who was in the room, also expressed his doubt that LQ was guilty. We need to step back for a moment and take in what just happened, because this wasn't just a legal process. This was literally a life or death moment. LQ was still a child, still a boy, and yet here he was standing in a room with grown men who were deciding his fate. Make no mistake about it, no one really believed that LQ would see the inside of a courtroom. Everyone knew what was going to happen, that he would be lynched, and on the question of his so-called guilt, of whether he was the attacker, no one truly believed that he was. But did that even matter? Because for black people during this time, the accusation was the conviction. Can you imagine how LQ felt? What must have been going through his mind? This was supposed to be a normal day for him, a normal day of work. His chance to prove to his father and his family that he could contribute. And now he was standing in a room watching his life be negotiated. I can't even imagine the fear that took over him, the hopelessness that must have set in. But maybe, just maybe, he had a small sliver of hope. What if they saw the truth? What if they realized I'm not the man they're looking for? What if they let me go? That human instinct, that belief that if truth is soon discovered, that things will work out. But in reality, that was not the case for black people. That did not exist. We were never given the benefit of the doubt, only the presumption of guilt, only the presumption of dangerousness. And for so many, including LQ, his sentence had already been decided. As LQ's fate was being decided in the hospital, word spread across town that he was back. It didn't take long for the mob to return to the courthouse. But when they got there, they realized he wasn't inside. They quickly learned where he was. LQ was at the hospital. The mob rushed there, demanding that the sheriff turn him over. They wanted to get this over with, and Sheriff Roberts was the only thing standing in their way. At this point, every single second mattered. The mob could have stormed in and taken LQ at any moment. So the sheriff came up with a plan. He would get LQ out while others distracted the mob. As Sheriff Roberts hurried LQ into his police car, Judge Pegram and Attorney Carlton tried to calm the angry mob. And they weren't just angry, they were armed. Sheriff's deputies moved through the crowd, taking weapons as Judge Pegram pleaded with the men to follow him back to the courthouse. He promised them if they gave him a chance, he would ensure LQ received a quick trial and punishment. But soon, the mob was tipped off. Someone told them that they had been lied to. LQ was already gone. A man named Clyde Nash had the fastest car in town, and he volunteered to chase the sheriff down. Nash jumped into his car and took a few men with him and raced towards the Myrtle Bridge. Their goal was to cut the sheriff off. Meanwhile, Sheriff Roberts and LQ thought they had gotten away. When they got to the bridge, they saw Nash and another group of cars parked, blocking their path. And soon, another group of mob members were behind them, blocking their path of escape. They were completely surrounded. More than 1,000 people had gathered at that bridge, waiting for LQ, and yet there was no violence. No one fired. No fights. No arguments. Sheriff Roberts simply handed LQ over to the mob, and then he was tied to the flatbed truck and made to run alongside him as the truck drove back to Rocky Ford. I have to ask again, can you imagine what this moment must have felt like for LQ? Don't move past this so quickly. Really think about it. I want you to stop and sit in this moment. Think about what must have been going through LQ's mind. 1,000 thoughts, 1,000 miles an hour. Questions like, what's going on? Are they going to hurt me? Take my life? I just want to go home. Where are my parents? Maybe deep down he already knew that for Black people in moments like this, there were no second chances, no right answers, no magic words that could get him out of this. But in the end, there was only one answer to every one of those questions, and that was injustice. LQ was taken back to the spot of the alleged attack by Thad Parker, Bill Greer, and his father, Book Greer. They took him to the barn, a place where they could do what they wanted to him. These men wanted LQ to confess before they carried out their sentence on him, but he had nothing to confess to. It was inside this barn where horrific things occurred. LQ, this 17-year-old boy, was brutally beaten by these grown men. They punched him and kicked him and struck him over and over again. They demanded he confess, but he would not, because he had nothing to confess to. They stripped him of his clothes. They hung him from the barn rafter. And still, he would not confess. So they burned him with a blowtorch, singed the hair off his body. They mutilated him, cut him. They used a lemon squeezer to crush LQ's testicles. This was unspeakable brutality. But to these men, it was easy. It didn't bother them. Not that they were doing this to a child. Not that LQ had never been positively identified as Bessie's attacker. Because to them, LQ wasn't a child. He wasn't even a person. He was just another Black body to destroy. LQ's only crime was being Black. Bessie said a Black man did it, LQ was Black, and that was enough. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need an investigation. They didn't even need to talk to Bessie, because that is what it was like for Black people. Conviction on sight. Prosecution and a death sentence without evidence. Blackness was the crime. Blackness was the trial. Blackness was the conviction. Blackness was the reason for your sentence, the death penalty. LQ Ivy, just 17 years old, was experiencing something that countless other Black men had suffered before him. Now, I need to prepare you for what's coming. From here, the story gets worse. Much worse. Unimaginably worse. I want you to know that up front. What I'm about to tell you will anger many of you. Some of you may even feel physically sick. That's how disturbing it is. But as troublesome as it is to hear, we have to finish LQ's story. We have to tell everything that happened to him. Some refuse to believe this happened. Some try to erase it, but we know the truth because it happened over and over again. Thousands of times, thousands lynched, thousands railroaded in unjust courts, thousands brutalized, thousands terrorized, thousands stolen from this world. And even though some want to turn the page on what has happened, we won't. We honor these victims by telling their stories. This is hard to hear, but imagine what it was like to live through this. So take a deep breath. We're not done yet. Now let me tell you what happened to LQ. After torturing, brutalizing, and mutilating LQ, there was only one thing left to do. One final act of mob rule to carry out. And that was to take LQ's life. There was never a question, never a moment of hesitation. It didn't matter whether LQ confessed or not. His fate was sealed. Sealed the moment the dogs came upon him and the other two Black young men taking a rest at the well. And now the mob had one final decision to make: how they would do it. For LQ, a rope and a tree wouldn't be enough. They wanted something more, something worse. They wanted to set him on fire. And they weren't going to do it in secret. They wanted an audience. They wanted a crowd. They wanted witnesses. And they wanted to send a message to every Black person. This is what happens to you This is what we can do to you. No one can stop us. We are the law, and you are nothing to us. This is going to be a spectacle, a public event, a celebration, a fun, joyous occasion. And all of it, every laugh, every cheer, will come at the expense of a 17-year-old boy. A boy who in all likelihood was innocent. The mob drove LQ to an open clearing, a place wide enough to accommodate the public burning. What was LQ thinking as they drove him to this execution? What thoughts raced through his mind? All I can think of is fear. Horrific fear. Fear that makes you sick to your stomach. Fear that takes your breath away. Fear so deep, tears refuse to fall. Unimaginable fear. But fear did not stop time. It didn't stop injustice, because injustice kept moving. LQ was brought to a large mound of sawdust and forced to stand there. He watched as the men drove a metal stake deep into the ground, a stake he would be tied to. As the men prepared to burn him alive, LQ bowed his head and he prayed. He prayed for himself and he prayed for the men. He asked God to save him. That was all that he could do in that moment. After everything was set up and in place, the mob did something to make sure they would never forget this moment. They took a picture to freeze this moment in time. They wanted to memorialize this pain. They wanted proof that they were a part of this horror show. They were proud of what they were about to do, and they wanted everyone to know that they were there, that they did this. Before I continue, I need to prepare you for what you're about to see. Up until now, we've been using the stand-in image for LQ. In these videos, we often do this to give a face to their story, because we rarely have images of them, but there is an image of LQ. There is a real photo of him standing with the mob. We haven't showed it yet because this is a painful picture to look at. It shows LQ in his final moments, and I didn't want to show it over and over again. But now, this is LQ Ivy. This is the boy who was tortured in the barn. This is the 17-year-old black teen moments before he was about to be burned alive. Don't move past this moment. Really look at him. Take it in. Think about what he was going through in this moment. He was alone. He was afraid. And he was moments away from dying a horrific death. But LQ wasn't really alone. As he stood there in fear and in terror, he was surrounded by a mob of unshaken determination. Take a look at them. Look at how they stand there, proud and defiant, without an ounce of shame. LQ in the middle, flanked by these men. No sheets, no hoods, no cover of darkness. This was broad daylight. It was them, looking straight ahead. They weren't hiding. They weren't afraid of being seen, because they knew there would be no consequences. They wanted this moment to be remembered, to be celebrated, to be a warning, because in their minds, it was just another Sunday, and LQ was just another black person about to be lynched. I've been a lawyer for a long time, and I've handled some pretty tough cases. Needless to say, I've seen a lot. When you're involved in police brutality, wrongful death, or personal injury cases, you see some pretty gruesome images. But I don't think I've ever seen images that grip me like these. It wasn't that these were the most gruesome things I've ever seen. It was something else. It was the calmness. Here was a teenage boy, surrounded by men who were about to inflict horror on him. And that's what makes it so chilling. There was peace in their horror, calmness in their cruelty. And here was this black boy, looking at the camera, almost as if he's looking at you, waiting for his next moment. And maybe it's just me, but I see in his face that he knew that it was over. There are many images of lynching victims, but most of them were taken after everything was over, after the life had been taken, after the mob had gone home. But images like this one, ones taken before the act was carried out, are rare. And in many ways, they're worse, because we see the hopelessness in the victim. We see the understanding that there is no way out, and we see the mob pause to memorialize their savagery. Think about that. They paused. They stopped before carrying out the brutality, just to make sure that they got the photo right. And that moment, that pause to pose for the camera, tells us everything we need to know about the depth of human depravity. Because this wasn't just a photo. This was a carefully staged image that determined where they would stand, who was the right height for the shot, where they wanted their hands to be placed, if the lighting was good enough, if the photographer was at the right distance to capture everyone, and if LQ was in the right spot. Think about how much effort we put into taking a photo today, how we adjust the lighting, move around, get in position. They did even more to get the picture-perfect pre-lynching photograph. LQ knew there was no escaping this. He knew his fate was sealed. He knew he wasn't going home. He knew he was in his last moments. And he knew it was going to be brutal. LQ reached into his pocket and pulled out the keys to his father's car and handed them to Stout Nowlin. "Give these back to my father," he said. Nowlin looked at LQ. Then he said, "If you did it, be a man and own up to it," as if LQ's confession would somehow cleanse the mob of what they were about to do. LQ looked at him and shook his head. "I didn't do it," he pleaded. One last time, but no one cared. This burning was going forward, confession or not. Nowlin took the keys and said, "I'll give them to your father." They took wooden planks and soaked them in kerosene. Then they poured kerosene all over LQ. He was tied to the stake, wrapped in chains, his feet, his wrists, his neck, all locked in place. The mob made sure there was enough kerosene-soaked wood around him. Then, one last time, LQ was asked if he wanted to confess. Later, the mob would claim that he did, that he not only confessed, but he named 3 accomplices. But you have to take that with a grain of salt, because Bessie never said there were 4 men. She said there was only 1. So this so-called confession wasn't the truth. It was just another lie, a lie to justify what they did next. Think back to how this day started. It started with promise. It started with LQ excited to work, to make money. It started with one black teen setting out to have a normal, regular day. But he never thought it would end like this. He never thought it would end with him tied to a stake, preparing to be burned alive. This was black life. At any moment, your entire world could change. The rug ripped from beneath you. No warning, no reason. Injustice could snatch you, could take your life in an instant. The time had come to finish this. 5 men, 1 woman. They struck matches. Then, one by one, they threw them onto the kerosene-soaked wood. The fire caught. Then it climbed. Then it roared. The flames rose, swallowing LQ. LQ kicked. He thrashed. He screamed. He screamed for his life. He was 17 years old, alone, burning alive, for something he did not do. Apparently, one of the women in the crowd could not take it. A woman named Ro Manor. She came out from the crowd and begged the rest of the mob to stop this grisly act. But no one listened. So she acted. She ran forward and threw water onto the fire. But before the flames could die, men rushed in and grabbed her. They held her back because this was going to happen. Nothing and no one was going to stop this horrific act. The fire raged. The heat burned the air. LQ kept fighting. Somehow, he freed his legs, but his arms and his neck still chained. His 17-year-old voice cried out through the flames, but no one cared. In fact, they relished every single second. From the crowd, a voice rang out. He should have thought about this before. Then another that said, "It's time to finish this." They piled more wood around LQ. The fire then completely consumed his body. And as it did, LQ screamed to God again and again. But his final words, his last breath on earth, were, "I didn't do it." And with that, LQ was gone. His life stolen. His death slow and agonizing. His last moments on earth filled with terror and pain. I struggled to find the words to talk about this. The English language simply isn't expansive enough to truly capture what happened to this child. Because this was pure savagery. And they carried it out with glee. They carried it out with joy. And they carried it out with pride and with determination. And they carried it out for one reason. Because LQ was black. And because he was black, he was denied dignity in life. And he was denied dignity and death. He was only entitled to two things: injustice and brutality. After the mob was done, they were tired and they were hungry. It had been a long day's work, so many of them left. They went into town to get something to eat because what they had just done didn't ruin their appetite. If anything, it made them hungrier. And they weren't bothered by the screams, and they weren't haunted by what they had done. This was life to them. Torturing and burning a 17-year-old boy alive wasn't something to hide. It was something to celebrate. And that's exactly how they planned to end this night, by celebrating what they had just carried out. Before I end this part of the story, there's something else you need to know. There's another image from that day, one that I haven't shown you. It's LQ tied to the stake. I didn't show it here because some things are just too painful, but I think you should see it. You need to see what brutality looked like, what injustice was. See what they did to this black child. I've included it on my website's blog for those who have the strength to see it. And if you choose not to look, I understand, because this isn't just history, it's horror. And even for me, learning about this, seeing these images, it was difficult. So far, we've been following LQ's story, what happened to him before and after the arrest. But we haven't talked about his family, because there were two sides to this suffering, two strands of pain twisted together. One endured the flames, and the others endured the waiting. Both were tortured in different ways. LQ never came home after work, and his family grew worried. His father, Jim Ivey, soon got word that his youngest son had been arrested. He rushed to New Albany to see what was happening, to try to save his boy, but he was too late. By the time he reached the courthouse, the mob was already there, already assembled, already angry, already demanding his son. Jim Ivey was just one man, and he was no match for an angry mob. He knew there was nothing he could do, no one to plead to, no one to ask for help. And so he did what so many black mothers and fathers had to do in moments like this. He turned around and he went home. He knew the mob would have its way. He knew that his son would likely die. What did Jim say when he walked through their door? What words did he have for Allie? What did he tell his children about their brother? We don't know exactly what he said, but we do know what it meant. A father returning home without his son. A house filled with silence. A silence heavy with dread. But this was Mississippi in 1925. A time when a black person could be lynched and no one cared to do anything about it. Black people were lynched for fun. A time when suffering was expected. A time when brutality was a certainty. They knew what was coming. They just didn't know how. By Saturday afternoon, word spread through the black community. LQ had been taken. The mob had him. Their worst fear, the one they always carried, had come true. The mob had taken their son. And now it was only a matter of time. But yet, still they prayed. They prayed for a miracle. LQ's family gathered at Baker's Chapel Church with friends and family. They did their best to comfort one another. But between the prayers and the embraces, there were tears. Between the hymns and the songs, there were sobs. Between reaffirming scriptures of deliverance, there was gut-wrenching hopelessness. The feeling that there was nothing they could do. They could not save their boy. When no more news came, the family left the church. They went home, but they didn't sleep. Not far from Jim and Allie's home was another family that was also waiting. Eliza Visor was LQ's aunt. She was Allie's sister. She had known LQ since the day he was born. And now she was waiting up, knowing her little nephew was in grave danger. Inside the Visor home, the doors were locked. The lights were off. The family hid away, waiting. Eliza sent her own children to bed. Macy and AJ couldn't sleep because outside the road wasn't empty like it usually was. They could hear it, the passing cars, one after another. They peeked out the windows and they saw 29 cars go by, far more than the usual for this quiet road. And with every passing headlight, they wondered, did those drivers know something about LQ? Did they know what had already been decided? The next morning was Sunday, but it wasn't just any Sunday. It was the Sunday after the mob took LQ. Still, the family hadn't heard any news, so they did what they always did. They prepared for church. But in that church, there was no peace, because LQ was on their hearts, on their minds. And when the service ended, Eliza went straight to see her sister. Eliza was hoping that maybe she could help comfort her sister. When she arrived, she found Allie lying across her bed, silent. She didn't move. She didn't speak. Eliza sat beside her, and together they sat in silence, because there was nothing left to say. That afternoon, Eliza returned home to tend to her own family, but she barely made it through the door when she saw her white neighbors, Rush and America Scott, approaching. They had been to the lynching site. They had seen what was happening, and they had come to deliver the news. The mob was about to burn LQ alive. What she heard was unbearable. The thought of her nephew being burned alive was horrendous. But what she had to do next was even worse. She had to tell her sister. She was the person who had to break the news to her sister that her boy was about to die a horrific death. And with the weight of this responsibility, Eliza headed back to see Allie. When she made it back to Allie, she looked at her sister and said, "Allie, you told me if I heard anything, come back and tell you." She paused, then said, "They're burning up your child today." Allie slumped into a chair. She didn't cry. She just moaned, a sound that no one ever forgot. The life was knocked out of her right then and right there. Now, don't move past this too quickly. Sit here. Stay right here in this moment, in that room. Two sisters, two black women, two mothers, one carrying the news, the other carrying the loss. Can you even imagine? Can you imagine what it took for Eliza to say those words? Your child will be burned today. Can you imagine what it did to Allie to hear them? This is what injustice did, what it was designed to do. It shattered black lives. It stole their peace. It crushed their dignity. And it took Allie and Jim's boy. Her family said that she began to die right there. And within a year, Allie was dead. After the mob was done, a white man named Sam Bullock sent word to Jim Ivey. He could come and collect what was left of his son. But Jim Ivey couldn't do it. He couldn't drive to that site. He couldn't see his son like that. He just couldn't. So the task fell to LQ's brother JD and two of his friends, Shep Boone and Gates Kilpatrick. They would go. They would help bring LQ home. When they arrived at the lynching site, JD couldn't move. He sat in the car, staring. This is where his brother died. This was where they burned him alive. His hands shook and his body felt weak. And when he tried to step out, he just couldn't. So Shep said he would do it. Shep stepped forward, and all he saw was a pile of burned wood and ash and ruins and charred remains. Almost nothing. But then in the remains, he saw it, what he believed to be LQ's heart, and he retrieved it and placed it in an apple box and carried it back to the car, because that was all that was left of LQ. That was all they had to bury, and they laid LQ to rest at Baker's Chapel Church later that day. In the days that followed, Union County whispered about what happened. The story spread behind closed doors, in barbershops, in hushed and fearful conversations. No one spoke too loudly because the truth was clear and there was fear amongst the black population. So black people stayed silent. There was no public grief, no loud cries in the street, just quiet mourning behind closed doors, because speaking too much, too openly, could bring trouble. On Monday, when the newspapers ran the story of what happened, the school children gathered to read it. Among them was Inez Williams, LQ's girlfriend. She read the words. She read what they did to LQ, and she broke down. She cried uncontrollably. She shook her head and was overwhelmed. She couldn't understand how they could do something like that to someone so young, someone that she loved and cared about. As for the mob, no one was ever held accountable. Everyone knew who did it, and the mob wasn't hiding. They had their faces in full view. They posed for pictures, because this wasn't a crime to them. It was a celebration. Officials claimed that they couldn't identify a single person who was present that day. Sheriff Roberts swore that he didn't recognize a single one of the 1,000+ people who stormed the bridge and took LQ from his custody. Mississippi's governor, Henry Whitefield, promised to launch an investigation, but that was just talk. William Bradshaw, one of the mob members, didn't just stay quiet. He bragged. He laughed at the idea of justice. He said no one would ever point a finger because they were all neighbors, because they all knew each other, because silence was the code. A grand jury was called, but everyone knew what that meant. It meant nothing. No arrests, no trials, no consequences. Because there was never going to be justice for L.Q. Ivy. Call it fate, call it coincidence, but one by one, many of the mob members met their own gruesome ends. Players Trainum, who was related to Mamie Gaines, Bessie's sister, died in a car crash, but it didn't just take him. It took his entire family. Clyde Nash, the man who ripped L.Q. from the sheriff's custody, owned a car garage. One day, a freak accident occurred, leaving him crippled for the rest of his life. Doyle Gaines, Bessie's brother, developed leukemia, and before he died, he lost his mind. Joe Keith Robbins was a severe drunk, and he drank so much he got Jake-legged, a form of paralysis from bad liquor. Hugh Pittman drank himself into a deep darkness, and one night, he ended his own life. Bill Greer was another heavy drinker. One winter night, he froze to death, and when they found him, his body had already started to decompose. And then there was Pauline Coffey, one of the people who threw the match that set L.Q. on fire. Years later, the fire came for her. Her electric blanket caught fire, and she couldn't escape. She burned to death. And what about Bessie? For years, whispers followed her. Some in town believed she had made the entire story up. Bessie had a child out of wedlock the year before, and she had a reputation. And some believed she accused L.Q. to cover up one of her affairs. Decades later, a researcher uncovered a startling detail. A doctor examined Bessie on the day of her alleged attack. He found no physical signs of violation, but he did find something else. She was pregnant. The doctor suspected that her accusation wasn't about L.Q., but it was about hiding her pregnancy, because claiming she was attacked gave her an excuse, one that would allow her to get a legal abortion. And years later, researchers uncovered something else. Stories passed down in the community suggested that even on the day, there were reasons to doubt L.Q.'s guilt. According to one account, a white gas truck driver had been seen that morning walking across the field heading towards Bessie Gaines' home. And there was another piece to this story. Russ Scott, a white man who had driven L.Q. and the others to work that morning, would later tell officers what should have been obvious. The timeline didn't make sense. L.Q. was 2.5 miles away, cutting timber. And according to Scott, there was no way he could have made it to the Gaines house and back in time. But none of that mattered, because once the accusation was made, L.Q. was guilty. That was all the mob needed to know. Bessie lived another 35 years before she died in 1960 at the age of 56. I told you earlier that L.Q.'s mother, Allie, didn't last long after losing her son. Her family said that the weight of what happened to her was too much to bear. She was gone within a year. And Jim Ivy, L.Q.'s father, he lived another 41 years. He died in 1966. He was 93 years old. Jim lived through the first days of Black freedom. He saw Reconstruction. He saw segregation take hold. He watched Jim Crow tighten his grip. He lived through the rise of the Klan, through the Great Depression, through the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and the 1960s. He survived every era of Black struggle after slavery. But he couldn't do one thing. He couldn't save his son. He couldn't protect L.Q. from the injustice that was constant through every one of those eras. And no matter how long he lived, he carried that to his grave. The mob did what they did to L.Q. because to them, he wasn't human. That is what was required to carry out this kind of brutality. A person must be stripped of dignity, stripped of their humanity. Only then can you truly engage in something like this. L.Q. wasn't human to them anymore. And when you add in the race to the equation, it made this act of brutality even easier to carry out. Black people were often stripped of their humanity. How else could they be enslaved? Worked like animals, brutalized, terrorized, lynched, burned alive. But we tell L.Q.'s story because he was human. He was a Black teenager. He was someone's son, someone's brother, a nephew, and a friend. He wasn't an object to be discarded. He was loved and he was cared for. He was nurtured. He wasn't inanimate. He had feelings and he had emotions. He experienced joy and happiness. He experienced pain and fear. He experienced everything that they did to him. And even though they wanted to erase his memory, we won't. We won't let his life be forgotten. We won't let his death be lost to time. We will remember him. We will tell a story. For him, and for his family, and for those who need to know. What LQ endured, what countless black people endured, was real. It happened for centuries. And despite those who want to turn the page, I won't. And I hope that you won't either. We have to tell these stories because what happened to us was real. We're not making it up, and it still matters today. Now I want to hear from you. Had you ever heard of LQ Ivy before today, and how did it make you feel learning about him? Leave me a comment down below and let me know your thoughts.